Hello, and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I am excited for this show. It's Friday afternoon. I have Ed Sealover in studio with me. He is a reporter for the Denver Business Journal. If you've never heard the show before, welcome, Ed. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on today.
Yes, I believe this is the first time you and I have done this alone without Jeff Wasden being here.
Yes, which we'll see how that goes, but I'm anticipating good things.
Yeah, I am as well. I'm not as quick fire or as knowledgeable as Jeff is. I don't attend the Senate to do any testifying as Jeff does. So I'm a little lower impact here.
That's all right. That's what we need on National Margarita Day. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. Which, I'm really sad. I tried to get some made for us. Wasn't able to. Something about working while drinking. I don't know.
Yeah, something about being on the air while drinking sounds like a bad idea. So I guess coffee will have to suffice for the moment. Yeah.
Yes, we all have our vices, and caffeine this late in the afternoon is not one of mine. But that being said, Ed, you are here in capacity because you have a brand new article series that you do every Monday, and it is called the Colorado Business Preview.
Yes, the Capital Business Preview is something. That's
Preview.
all right. CBP. It's something that we started about a month ago, and the idea was this. I've been writing about the legislature for 13 years. 10 of which have been for the Denver Business Journal, and we cover a lot of things, but a lot of them are retrospective. Here's what happened. Here's what's going to happen next. This is our way of trying to get people involved. If this is an issue that matters to you, here's what's coming up this week. Come out to the Capitol, call your legislators, let your voice be known. And so it's just something that kind of gives me one more chance to dive into things before they're happening, to let people know that if they care, it's time to speak up.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and the nice thing about this is that it's not just for business owners and leaders. It is geared towards them, right? They are very much involved and need to be involved in legislation. But that being said, if you're employed, these are going to hit you too.
Yes. There's nothing about these. People talk about business bills, and people often think about, oh, well, that's just business owners. Well, no, that's actually every employee of a firm that happens to be owned by somebody. Businesses are run by people. They're not run by robots yet. And so, this is our chance to say, hey, maybe you should know about this too, because if your boss suddenly is getting swamped with lawsuits or has to pay these fees or do something differently, it's going to affect your job as well, including possibly whether you will keep it or whether you will even get that second employee that you're hoping to share some of your load.
Yes. Well, speaking of lawsuits, we have one that's pretty big out there coming. You just wrote about this one on the 18th, and that is the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act.
Yes, and we should say the lawsuits aren't quite coming yet, but that is the biggest deal around this bill. Frankly, the idea of men and women being paid equally for doing the same job is not a controversial one. Nobody came to the Capitol this week during the first hearing to say, boy, I really don't support women get paid equally to men.
At least not out loud.
At least not out loud. At least they didn't show up to this hearing. But this is all about the devil in the details here. The bill does a couple of things. One, it requires that all jobs be advertised. The idea there is that it will get a broader group of people to apply for it, and maybe women who had not applied for an upper-level job will now be applying for it. Two, it prohibits bosses and prohibits employers from asking job applicants about their salary history. The idea being that if women have traditionally been paid lower, knowing their salary history as a starting point for negotiations coming in will just perpetuate that lower pay scale. The third thing, though, and there are some slight concerns about that. For example, opponents of the bill say, well, we should allow job applicants to volunteer their salary, because especially if they're getting paid beyond what their counterparts are right now, that's going to help them to be able to negotiate a continued high salary. Or they say, look, the idea of advertising jobs to everyone in your company is kind of absurd. If you're advertising a C-suite level job, you're not going to want to make sure your janitorial staff knows about it. But the third thing that this bill does, and that is the most controversial part, is that it creates a new private right of action for people who feel, for women who feel They have been discriminated against with unequal levels of pay. They can sue. And the way this bill is phrased, there are a lot of concerns in the business community that this is going to open the doors to a flood of lawsuits. That this is one of those things that anybody who doesn't get the job they want can suddenly come back and say, look, I didn't get the job I wanted because I'm a woman, because of this or that. It is Jennifer Waller, the Colorado Bankers Association COO, called it the sue first and see what happens later aspect of the bill. And I should say that during the first hearing on Wednesday, there were a number of changes that were made at the behest of businesses. This was not one of them, though. The businesses specifically said, take out the private right of action, and there's a good chance we drop our opposition. And that's not just hyperbole. Earlier this year, the Ban the Box bill, a measure that would prohibit employers from asking on job applications whether or not applicants have criminal history, got through a committee, and businesses dropped their opposition, years-long held opposition, after the private right of action was taken out of the bill. This would go through a state government if there are aggrieved parties that say, I want to look into this. That did not happen, though. Jesse Danielson, who's one of the co-sponsors of the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, has said, it is important to me. I think that having that private right of action is going to be the only way to remediate some of these years-long pay discrimination problems. Businesses of all sizes are saying that doesn't work for me, and I think this is going to be quite a dogfight going forward, especially because the Senate hinges on just 2 votes. I mean, this cannot be, yes, this could go through on a full partisan level, but if the Republicans can get just 2 Democrats to break from the party and not even to vote against the bill, but to say, no, let's eliminate the private right of action, this could be a different ballgame.
It could absolutely be a different ballgame. And that being said, we know that the legislative session only goes till May. Do you think there's a possibility this will be dropped altogether?
No, I don't. And I think that both leaders of both the Senate and the House have said this is a priority bill. So I think this is going to go through. It's just a matter of the details that are in it. And it's that private right of action. I spoke to House Speaker Casey Becker about this, and the bill isn't going to end up in the House for a while still. And I said, look, your chamber negotiated the end of the private right of action to ban the box bill, and that got through. I'm like, are you willing to do the same thing here? And she was very cautious. She said, I want to see where the debate goes. I want to see where this bill is when it gets to my house. So, I mean, there are a lot of people who probably would love this right of action to be in the bill who are going to look at this pragmatically, too, to see what can get this through without the business community being up in arms about this.
Yes, I love it. Moving on, we have a lot to talk about.
Absolutely. There's a lot going on at the session this year.
As you mentioned, the Ban the Box, that one did get passed, yes.
Yes. Well, it passed its first committee, and in fact, I believe it got out of its second committee this morning and is probably going to the House floor next week. But yeah, this is, for those who don't follow it, it's a bill that is that simple. It says you cannot ask about criminal history of an applicant in an initial application. That doesn't mean you can't run a background check on somebody. It doesn't mean you can't ask them about it when they get into the actual sit-down face-to-face interview. But the proponents of this have said that too many people are being vetoed by checking that box on top of their form, and especially as we try to get people out of the criminal system back into society, having a job is one of the most important things to do it. Business leaders traditionally and still do say, I don't like you determining how I do my hiring. Small businesses especially. I mean, the truth is, if you're Walmart, you've got an entire legion of people who can check criminal background histories on a national level for anyone who applies for a job there. If you have 7 employees, you're hoping you hire the right person. And in fact, in many ways, you have to hire the right person as a better fit because they're going to be a much larger percentage of your operations. But this bill advanced out of its first committee, still on a largely partisan basis, but with business leaders going neutral on it, which is a big deal for this bill after a couple of changes were made, the biggest one being the private right of action we talked about, but also a 2-year delay in implementation of this bill for companies with less than 10 employees, that giving small businesses who don't have a lobbyist telling them what's going on more time to understand this, take it off their applications, be able to work around it. So no doubt this one will be signed into law by Governor Jared Polis. It's just a matter of will they be able to get any Republicans on board, and is the business community totally sold on this, or are they clenching their teeth and saying, look, we can't do anything more. We've done the best we can. Let's let it move forward.
Right. Speaking of signing, Jared Polis signed one of his first signings was the beer.
His very first bill signed into law, January 31st, was a beer bill. It was very Hickenlooperian in that way. You really expected that the beer bills would have ended with our brewer governor exiting the office. Yeah. But this was a bill that, for the past 3 years, has been intense debates about grocery stores selling full-strength beer. And as part of 2 bills that passed over the last 3 years, it allowed for that. And that actually started on January 1st. I'm sure a lot of people know this by now. But a clause in the bill basically set up a new license for these grocery and convenience stores that sell full-strength beer. And the way it was written, that meant that brewers would have to produce, package, and transport beer separately that was going to this new license from the beer that was going to the old licenses, as in restaurants, liquor stores, taverns, etc. And small breweries said this is absurd, and B, we physically can't do this. We don't have enough space to brew and package beers differently for these two. So the Liquor Enforcement Division gave them until February 1st to enforce that rule, hoping that in 3 weeks they could get a bill passed that would change it. They did. It actually went through, the session opened on January 4th. It was through both chambers unanimously by January 23rd. Polis sat on it for 8 days. Nobody quite knows why. I think there was a rumor going around that he wanted his first bill to be about something other than beer, but signed it on January 31st with a few hours left to go to make sure that craft breweries could still sell their beer to grocery stores.
Which makes me happy, because if I'm going to buy grocery store beer, I'd still like to feel bougie, right?
Yes.
I appreciate that. So we were just talking here. So February 4th, you came out with one of your articles. Again, that is the Capital Business Preview. I didn't speak this time about that one.
That's all right. It's not branded enough for me to worry about it yet.
Well, we're hoping to get there. But that being said, we had a lot of bills on this one that felt like small kind of environmental changes. So we're talking specifically here Senate Bill 34 and House Bill 1143. And those respectively are talking about all ready-to-eat food containers must be recyclable or compostable, and then single-use plastic straws are only given if the customer requests that item.
Yes. Now, you frame these as being environmental bills, and frankly, Conservation Colorado is pushing, at least I know, the to-go container bill. I'm not sure about the plastic straws bill. But restaurants look at this as, well, this is mega regulation, really, excuse me, not mega, meta regulation for the restaurant industry. Senate Bill, we should differentiate between these two, because they're both, I wrote about them in early February. Both of them actually got delayed and are coming up in the next week for their first hearings. House Bill 1143 is the bill that would say you can only give out plastic straws to customers inside the store if they ask for them. That's what its events are going to be. I don't know if there's an amendment on it yet allowing for you to give out straws to drive-through customers, since it would actually be physically unsafe to give a drink without a straw to a drive-through customer. That was actually asked for by the Restaurant Association. And the fear there was that if they didn't make a statewide rule saying this, local cities and towns would start implementing their own rules, and they would have to, demanding bamboo straws here or something like that. And it would be really hard to live with that patchwork. So this is one that's going to go through, that's already been negotiated. The one that's not been negotiated is Senate Bill 34. And this is a bill that would say local governments could, if they choose, regulate to-go containers, basically demanding that a to-go container, typically a fast food container, would have to be recyclable or compostable. This one kind of hit the restaurants out of nowhere. And there are concerns about this for a couple of reasons. One of them is that if you get food waste on a container, they're not recyclable anymore. So you're talking just compostable right now. But the second is kind of the same thing about the straws bill, that they are worried about the patchwork of regulations that could come about. And especially if someone, like say, in a smaller town, in a Western Slope town, were to do this, it would be a lot harder to get that packaging for those restaurants as well. I mean, right now, you see a lot of people rushing toward these ideas of regulating to-go packaging and straws, and the production chain, the supply chain, just isn't there yet to be able to supply the world with bamboo straws and compostable containers. And so they're really hoping to expand the definition of what counts as a recyclable or compostable container so that 75% of the restaurants, or of what restaurants use, can still be used under this. Otherwise, you could see supply chain problems with this as well. But overall, it's just surprising to some people that we're getting to this level of regulation about what restaurants can and can't hand to their customers.
And it's overwhelming. Most businesses already have a lot of regulations. There's a huge argument in Colorado that we're over-regulated. I feel like we're doing pretty good, but I think this is a stretch for sure. That being said, I would like to move on to oil and gas changes.
Speaking of regulation,
exactly.
Yes. And for acute watchers of the legislature, their next question might be, I haven't seen any oil and gas changes. And that is true. This is one of those topics that I've written about. I try to get way out in front of here before the changes come. The bills are still weeks away, say House Speaker Becker and Senate Majority Leader Steve Fenberg, who are writing these. But the bill, and it's going to be one omnibus bill, is going to have two main thrusts to it. One of it is going to be changing the mission of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. These are the folks who decide on the approval or denial of drilling permits across the state. Right now, the COGCC has not just the mission of kind of protecting the state's resources, but also promoting the oil and gas industry. Democrats want to remove promotion of the industry from there. The second thing is that Democrats really want to require that public health and safety be the first and foremost consideration when COGCC debates whether or not to grant a permit. If you may remember, this was the subject of what was called the Martinez case that went to the Colorado Supreme Court, where a young activist sued and said, this has to be the number one concern. The court shot that down and said, no, it doesn't. COGCC considered this. It decided that's not its concern, and it is within its purview to enact or not enact this. Well, the Democrats said, okay, well, clearly we're going to make the COGCC enact this now because we can change its purview. So those are those two factors, as well as local authority. And this one is a little bit nebulous still. Democrats are talking about allowing local governments to regulate noise, smell, lighting, things like that around oil and gas that they can actually regulate around almost any other business right now, but not oil and gas operations, because that is completely within the purview of state government. What is not going to be in this bill, according to Becker and Fenberg, are a couple of things. One, we're not going to see setbacks of a defined length. Voters rejected Proposition 112, which would have required 2,500-foot setbacks from oil and gas wells between buildings, playgrounds, rivers, dried river beds, ant holes, anything that could be considered.
Colorado.
Yeah, anything that could be considered a delicate area. And they said, look, the voters rejected it. We're not going back there. There there had also been rumors of a moratorium, statewide moratorium on oil and drilling. And both Fenberg and Becker said, absolutely not. We are not going for that whatsoever. The other thing that has come up in the past that doesn't appear that it's going to be part of this is the idea of zoning as a local government purview. We've seen bills that said governments can zone oil and gas like they do other areas, and therefore basically zone it out of a lot of areas. I'm told by people within negotiations, not necessarily Becker and Fenberg, but others, that it's just impossible to do that, mostly because oil and gas wells don't typically go within the industrial areas where other such usages would go. They're going into agricultural areas. They're going in some places into residential areas, which is causing a lot of this friction right now. But the zoning aspect of this is not going to push forward. What this means in general, what people are telling me is that this is not going to be a bill that is going to drive the oil and gas industry out of business. This is going to be a thoughtful, reasoned approach to it. The question that comes from that then is that will that be enough for the environmental activists who have already threatened to put another setbacks measure on the 2020 ballot? If there are no setbacks addressed in this bill by Democratic leaders, by people, Steve Fenberg and Casey Becker are both from Boulder. Let's remember that. So by people who are right in the heart of the environmental community, will that be enough for the environmental activists? And if it's not, will they have enough support to go out and try this again? Or will even, some of the more liberal-leaning Democrats say, look, the legislature took care of this?
Absolutely. We've already heard from the voters. I feel like it would be a waste of money for those environmental people to push again for the 2020 bill, but we'll see. We will absolutely see. Doesn't mean that they won't try.
There's a lot of activists that hear that and say, the heck with it, I'm going through with it, which is why we voted 6 times to stop the spread of gambling in this state, despite the fact that every vote is about 4-1 against. People still want to put that on the ballot. They haven't learned anything yet. Right?
Well, we are a vigilant group. I want to talk, before we have to end this segment here, local minimum wage.
Yes, this is a bill that's going to be introduced next week at the Capitol. I have not written about it yet. Just look at our website Monday. I'll have something up then. And it's a bill that has come up and died several times in the past few years that would say that city and county governments can, if they choose, raise their minimum wage above the state's level. The state is now an $11.10 minimum wage. It'll rise to $12 on January 1st and will rise by inflation after that. This essentially is a bill that acknowledges there are parts of the state that are a lot more expensive to live in and work in. The mountain communities and the Denver area are the two that are often cited by this. And proponents, including Representative Javon Melton, who's going to start this in the House, have said, look, we need to give people a living wage in these places. Earning minimum wage on the Eastern Plains does not mean the same thing as in Denver, and it's much harder to live in Denver on that. Businesses have said, this is not a good idea, though. And there's a lot of reasons. One, again, we're talking about a patchwork of rules. If you're a chain restaurant and you have locations in Lakewood, Aurora, and Denver, and they have 3 different minimum wages, that's going to be tough to run. Not only that, but imagine that you've got 2 employees from your Aurora store call in sick, and you've got to send 2 employees out from Denver to Aurora, and suddenly you're paying them a different level for one day working out there. This is the things that businesses say. Ultimately, this is something that would be left up to the voters, typically, I think, in most cities, although city councils certainly, or county governments certainly could pass this on their own. But it's a question of how much do we need to allow for a higher minimum wage, or is this just getting in the way of businesses running their businesses and throwing another costly regulation on top of them?
Yes. So besides the minimum wage, what can we see on Monday from Capitol Business Preview?
Capitol Business Preview this week is going to be talking about healthcare bills, as we're starting to see a lot, and this has been the biggest thrust of the first month, but we're going to see a lot more coming through in the next week. The reinsurance bill is the biggest one that's going to be starting. This is a bill that would essentially say that we will create a pool of money for insurance companies to dip into for the most expensive cases, and by doing that, they will be able to lower premiums on very high-priced individual plans. The tough thing about this year's bill is, instead of asking for a fee to cover that, they would be setting artificial limits on how much hospitals could charge privately insured individual market customers. And there is both an ideological debate and a debate from the hospital saying, you can't do this to us. If you do this, we're going to cut out our most expensive services like, say, trauma care to try to make this up. So this is going to be a fiercely debated bill about where the state needs to step in and where it shouldn't.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed. Always a pleasure to have you in studio. I really appreciate this. So again, keep an eye out on Monday. He's going to release the Capital Business Preview. Check out other articles on Denver Business Journal as well while you're there. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page. And you can find this podcast and more at cobart.com/radio-podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.